The rain had a way of flattening the city, pressing its edges into a soft grey blur, so that buildings seemed to sigh and the streets themselves forgot where they were going. It fell in sheets that stung the skin and crept under collars, found seams in coats and made a meal of them. Nell hunched her shoulders and tightened her grip on the worn leather portfolio pressed to her chest, counting the breaths between each splash her boots made in the growing river of the sidewalk. 15 minutes late already, she told herself. 15 minutes, and a life could tilt in one direction or another. The alley opened like a mouth to her left, dark, wet, and reeking of damp cardboard. She would never have noticed it, never have turned her head in that particular second, if not for the faintest scrape of something, like the hush of fabric against stone. She slowed, despite herself. The rain gathered on the brim of her cheap umbrella, trembled, and spilled over the edge in a clear bead that slid down the plastic like a tear. He sat with his back to the brick wall, legs stretched out, the soles of his shoes blown open so his toes touched the pooling water. His clothes were the colour of rainwater and neglect, denim gone grey, a jacket that had forgotten warmth. The hood was down. Dark hair, soaked to the scalp, lay in uneven stripes across his forehead. He didn't hunch or make himself small. He sat there as if the alley belonged to him, as if the cold could not touch him because he said it could not. Nell would have passed. She always told herself she would pass next time, because kindness had a cost, and her life had a ledger. Rent overdue. Utilities sobbing. A voicemail from her landlord that had not so much asked as threatened, then paused and threatened again. Morrison Associates would not wait for a woman who arrived dripping and breathless and apologizing to furniture. The portfolio against her chest felt like a flimsy raft in open water. She had to keep moving. Then he looked up. They were only eyes. She would remember that later. 1,000 things to notice about him, and she would always come back to that first impossible look. Amber, she thought wildly. Not brown, not gold, not the muddy mix of city light. Amber. The kind of colour that belonged to autumn leaves on fire, to old whiskey held against the sun, to the warning eyes of a wild creature who smelled thunder before any human ear could. Her foot caught on the broken edge of a paver, and the city yanked the ground out from under her. The portfolio slipped. The umbrella veered away like something startled into flight. Pens scattered. A cheap plastic case of paper clips burst open, the little silver mouths jumping like fish onto wet pavement. She watched in a strange, suspended clarity as the resume she had ironed between paper towels floated face down in a puddle, the ink ribboning outward in delicate blue veins. "Not again," she breathed, which was not a prayer so much as an old, tired complaint to the sky. She fell to her knees and reached with slick fingers for everything she could rescue. The battered Walkman that had survived 3 apartments and 1 spectacularly unfaithful boyfriend, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the 4 $1 bills that stood between her and an empty stomach later tonight. The rain doubled its insistence, as if the city itself meant to be done with the little arrangement of her life. She almost laughed. What else? What else? A hand appeared beside her own, pale and steady. He gathered her runaway belongings as if they mattered to him, pinched each paper clip from the grit with fastidious care, and dropped them into the trembling circle of her free palm. No fumbling, no jerks or grabs, just the gentle economy of someone who had made a lifetime of conserving motion. "I believe these are yours," he said. The voice was low and unforced, a warm baritone softened by rain. It felt absurd that a voice could sound warm when his skin must have been ice. Nell looked up. Rain splotched his lashes to dark spikes, beads clinging and refusing to fall. Close up, he looked less like a vagrant from a cautionary tale and more like a discarded statue, lines cut with an odd, old-fashioned precision, a mouth made for refusing. The right side of his jaw was shadowed by stubble. On anyone else, it might have looked like neglect. On him, it made his cheekbones cruel and beautiful in equal measure. "Thank you," she managed, and hated that her hands shook as she took the pile of pens and paper he offered. There were 100 things to do next. Count the bills, reassemble the portfolio, stand up and keep walking. She fumbled and found the money, felt its soft, tired texture against her fingers. 4 singles. Bus fare home. The possibility of dinner. The small, humming hope that a vending machine coffee could trick her into a second wind. Before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed the bills into his palm. "Here," she said, "get something warm to eat." She expected the look most people gave money on the street, a flicker of hunger or humiliation, a quick slide of the eyes to someplace safer. He did not avert his gaze. He looked at her like she had handed him something more difficult to accept than charity. There was a pause that might have been gratitude if gratitude had forgotten how to wear a smile. "Thank you," he said again. And how could 2 words, identical to the first ones, sound heavier in the mouth? He lifted his own hand a fraction, as if to return the money, then closed his fingers around it instead. The bones of his knuckles were elegant. She wondered why she had that word for a hand that had surely learned too many hard lessons. She would have gone then, she knew she should. But the alley made a slow, dark gesture, and only then did she see the bloom of crimson spreading under him, feathering out across the wet, blackened cardboard, as if the rain itself were drawing veins from a heart. The red turned pink where the water took it, and the sight tugged something deep and ancient in her, some instinct about blood and beasts and bodies that needed saving. "You're hurt," she said, and the words startled her with their fear. He glanced down, as if she'd pointed out an old stain on his shirt. The jacket fell open with the soft reluctance of soaked fabric and revealed a torn patch at his side. The blood that oozed did so with alarming calm. "It's nothing," he told her, which was either a lie or the kind of wishful thinking practiced by men who refused to admit the world could touch them. He was too pale for the warmth of his voice, too composed for anyone who was losing heat at this rate. And there was something else about him, some tension coiled in him that vibrated faintly through the air. "That's not nothing," she said, because stubbornness had always been her second language. "You need to get that looked at." He folded the breath to answer, then let it go as if even that small movement cost him. Nell looked at the alley wall above him, at the slick path the water made down the bricks, at the way the day narrowed to this point. A stranger, a wound, a choice. The interview wore a stopwatch around her throat. She imagined a receptionist checking a list and drawing a neat line through her name. She saw her rent notice, obscene with exclamation points. Then she saw the way he had handled the paper clips. "There's a pharmacy on the corner," she said. "I can—" "You are late," he said, as if he'd been listening to the clock she wore. "I saw you running." Nell felt a flush rise that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am," she admitted. "But it doesn't matter." "It always matters," he said. And for a second, Something authoritative cut through the soft edges of his rain-heavy tone. A leader's reflex, she thought, and then wondered why that word came to mind. He looked away toward the washed-glass mouth of the alley. "You should go." She wanted him to make it easy and let her pretend the world had forced her neglect. He did not. It was, in its way, a kind of mercy, one she could not accept. "I'm not leaving you here," she said. "Come with me. It's 2 minutes, and I have—" She searched her memory. Hydrogen peroxide, bandages, and soap. She grimaced at herself. Soap was not medicine. "We can at least clean it." He watched her hand when she offered it, as if her palm were a question with more than one answer. The rain grew louder in the space between them, a voice insisting on urgency. Somewhere beyond the alley, a car tire hit a pothole and hissed with indignation. Time moved like a reluctant animal. "I don't remember my name," he said suddenly, and the admission was so unexpected, so naked, that it drew her breath in and left it there, suspended. He frowned, as if the sentence itself surprised him. "I don't remember anything before." The word hung like fog between them. Before. Nell had always hated that life made cliff edges without fences. She'd learned to edge her way along anyway. She nodded once, more to herself than to him, and reached farther. "We'll figure it out later," she said. "Come on." He lifted his hand. Up close, the pallor of his skin was almost luminous where rain touched it, the veins a delicate map under the surface. His fingers were cold. The cool slid up her wrist like a startling ribbon. He let her pull him to his feet, though she suspected he could have stood without assistance if he had wanted to. The jacket clung to him, the fabric sucking drunk on water. When he moved, Nell recognized an economy in that movement too, not the slump of exhaustion, but something held back. The pharmacy smelled like eucalyptus and patience. Warm air hit her like a blessing, and she almost moaned with relief. The door chimed. A woman behind the counter looked up with the kind of efficient kindness born from years of being the one people arrive to when parts of them are failing. Nell tried to explain all at once, the rain, the alley, the blood, the fact that she was not a nurse, but could be if sheer determination counted. The pharmacist stepped out from behind the counter, already gathering what she needed, and the way her hands moved calmed Nell more than any assurance could have. "Deep cut?" the woman asked, brisk and sympathetic. "Looks like it," Nell said. "Here." She turned to gesture to the man and realized he had stopped just inside the threshold, as if crossing the warm brightness of the store felt like entering a foreign country. He was looking at the shelves with unsettling intensity, his eyes cutting over labels as if measuring the worth of each. When he finally focused on the pharmacist, his attention felt like sunlight magnified through glass, uncomfortably precise. "Antiseptic. Gauze. Tape," the woman murmured, thinking aloud. She pressed boxes into Nell's hands, a small stack that felt like relief, until the register spat out a number that might as well have been written in some unreachable currency. Nell counted her dollars with the private humiliation of counting hope in a public place. 4 bills, now only 2. Coins, silent and unhelpful. She swallowed, felt the old familiar tightness in her throat, and tried to find a way to make apology sound like a plan. I'm sorry. I have peroxide at home," she said. "Rubbing alcohol. Could I just—" The woman nodded and slid half the stack back with the clean efficiency of a trained mercy. Bandages, then. Keep it dry. Watch for redness, streaking, heat. If he gets a fever—" "We'll watch," Nell said. The plural landed between her and the man like a stone in a pond, rippling outward through a future she had not consented to, but felt forming around them anyway. Outside again, the rain had gathered into something more serious. It drummed against the awning with an impatient fist. He leaned against the brick face of the building and tilted his head back, letting the drops strike his face. For half a breath, he looked something less than human, something that had learned to take weather like a benediction. "My apartment is only a few blocks," she said, because there was nothing else to do and the world kept insisting on forward. "It's warmer there." "Drier?" He watched her with those strange eyes, and she could almost hear the gears of his caution spin, teeth catching and clicking. But when she moved, he fell into step beside her, his stride unhurried and oddly silent for a man of his size. She held the umbrella over both of them, and they became, for a block or two, a small, moving island. The city passed around them, a woman dragging a suitcase that wanted to argue, a delivery biker wrapped in a plastic poncho like a struggling jellyfish, the peppermint flare of brake lights in the wet. Her building was the kind that apologized by existing. The stairwell smelled of old water and older paint. The door to 1B sat slightly ajar, and Mr. Hoffman appeared in slippers and confusion, mumbling about missing keys and the betrayal of milk. Nell set the bandages down and guided him back into his apartment with gentle nudges and the tucking of a blanket around shoulders that had once been broader. When she turned, the man was there, quiet as rain, steadying Mr. Hoffman's elbow like he had a right to care. "Thank you," she said, surprised at how that gratitude hurt. There were too many muscles in a day that could wear out. "It's nothing," he said, a reflexive echo, and she could not tell whether he meant it. By the time she fumbled the key into her own lock, some part of her made a brief, preposterous inventory of everything inside. Dishes on the drying rack, one crooked framed photo of her mother taking up too little space on the wall, a potted plant too stoic for its own good, the couch that was comfortable only in theory. She stared for a long heartbeat at the doorway, then stepped back so he could pass with a motion that felt like the pivot of a hinge. "Wait here," she said, and darted into the bedroom for towels, a sweater, an old pair of jeans that had belonged to a life she had already outgrown. When she returned, he stood just inside the threshold, hands visible at his sides, the posture of a man who knew how to look harmless when he wanted to. It unsettled her more than anything else had. A dangerous man, she thought, would have blurred those edges, would have pretended not to understand that safety depended on her belief in it. "You can shower," she said, thrusting the towel at him like a peace offering. "It will help. There's—" she gestured helplessly. "Soap." Something like amusement ghosted at the corner of his mouth. "Soap is good." "In there," she said, and pointed to the bathroom, as if she were giving directions inside a museum to someone who had never seen a painting. When the water started, piping loud through the old pipes, the apartment felt smaller, as if the sound itself filled its corners. Nell sank onto the edge of the couch and looked down at her hands. They were damp and trembling, and she pressed palms to knees to quiet them. The room wore the faint smell of damp wool and the sharper, cleaner scent of the pharmacy, a smell that had always made her think of competence she did not yet possess. She reached for the phone and pressed the number for Morrison Associates with the kind of reckless hope that past kindness would currency itself as future lenience. The receptionist listened with that peculiar silence people wear when they have said no too many times already. "We appreciate your interest," the voice said. "We wish you the best in your search." The call clicked into stillness and waited there a moment before letting go. Nell set the phone down and closed her eyes. She could hear the water end and the small sounds of someone trying to make himself neat inside a space that did not belong to him, the whisper of a towel, the clink of a bottle against porcelain. The door opened, and she turned without meaning to. For a moment, words abandoned her. Clean. He was more himself somehow, as if the rain had been a disguise and the shower took what it wanted and returned him. The harsh lines softened. The dark hair lay obediently, stubble gone. His mouth looked younger and more dangerous. The sweater she had given him fit loosely across his shoulders and suggested strength without trying to make a spectacle of it. He looked like a story told about a particular kind of man, the one who arrives and changes the temperature in a room by remembering how to breathe. "Come here," she said, and felt the intimacy slice itself out of the ordinary shape of the words. "Let me see." He lifted the hem of the sweater without comment. The wound was not a scratch, not the yawning ruin she feared, but deep enough to shake her. Her hands moved over the supplies with a steadiness that did not belong to how she felt. The peroxide fizzed as if offended. He did not flinch, which made her more uneasy than a jerk would have. She cleaned and pressed and taped, and when her knuckles brushed the heat of his skin, her breath stumbled. Up close, he smelled of water and the anonymous hotel soap she had bought on sale, clean and faintly medicinal, but underneath, something else. The smallest animal, a thread of wild that had followed him inside and refused to be scrubbed away. "Who did this?" she asked, unable to swallow the question. "Men who did not approve of my choice of shelter," he said, as if explaining weather. He considered it for a second. "Or men who needed to approve of something. Over a place to sit during a storm? When there is nothing else to defend, territory is everything," he said quietly. And there was that voice again, the one that belonged to a person who had commanded with unthinking certainty. It vibrated through the air between them and made the hairs at the back of her neck lift in slow alarm, not of danger, but of recognition. The world carries some voices differently. It has learned not to argue. She taped the last strip of gauze with a care that was really an apology to the parts of him she could not repair. They were close, and for a long second neither of them moved. Nell could hear the clock on the stove insist on its minute. She let the sweater fall back into place and stepped away. Distance was a salve too. "You should stay until the rain stops," she said, and pretended firmness could cover generosity that made her uneasy. "Just tonight." "Just tonight," he echoed, and the way he said it made it sound like a vow he'd have to break to keep. The storm flexed its muscles, and the lights in the apartment flickered, then steadied. Outside, someone shouted to someone else the way people do when weather forces them into a closeness that feels offensive. The plant on the windowsill bent toward the weak insistence of cloudy light and then lost interest. "Thank you," he said, and meant the room and the bandages and the soap and the risk. He looked around as if mapping the corners he would occupy. "For this." "It's nothing," she said, "because that is what you say when the thing is a great deal, and admitting it would give it power you are not ready to hand over." He glanced toward the window, like a man who learned to read glass as if it were a kind of water. "It will be worse before it is better," he said. "That's weather," she said. He looked at her. "It is everything." She found blankets, a pillow linear with the indent of the last head that had used it, and arranged the couch into something that aspired to hospitality. He watched with that precise attention that never felt prying. When she stepped back, he tested the pillow with his hand, the way a child presses a surface and expects memory to arise under his palm. "Do you want tea?" she asked, and felt the domesticity pass through her like a mild surprise. She had not been anyone's kindness in a long time. The kettle sputtered into life on the burner with a noise like encouragement. She held out a mug when it was ready, and his fingers brushed hers, a small electric fact. "Tell me your name," she said impulsively, then flushed. "I mean, something to call you, until you remember." He frowned, not in irritation but concentration, as if each sound had to be weighed for its own gravity. His eyes slid to the bookshelf. The titles wore their second-hand lives with a certain shabby pride. He reached for one as if it had signaled him. The Brothers Karamazov, the spine fat with too many hands. "I remember this," he said, not quite to her. "Or the feeling of it." He touched the title as a man touches a scar, and then spoke a name he had taken from the book, or from the old country the name belonged to. "Dmitri," he said. It fit in his mouth like something he had practiced. "Until I recall otherwise." "Dmitri," she repeated, and the sound reached for him across the small space and found him. He drank the tea with a seriousness that made the cheap bag of chamomile feel like something rarer. He looked around her apartment once more, less as a survey, more as a courtesy. When his gaze returned to her, something softened that she had not realized was taut. He closed his eyes for the length of a blink that felt like sleep might follow it, then opened them again and smiled without showing teeth. "You should sleep," he said. "You're tired." "It shows." "It speaks," he said, and a corner of his mouth lifted in a shadow of humor. She turned off the kitchen light, and the room gathered itself into a quieter posture. Outside, the city muttered. She paused at the threshold of the bedroom, her hand on the doorframe the way a swimmer touches the edge of a pool. She felt eyes at her back and told herself not to turn. But she did, of course. He had settled on the couch, long body arranged with the kind of grace that made even discomfort elegant. The blanket lay over him to the waist. His hands were crossed over his ribs, as if he were guarding something gentle there. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Nell," he answered, and she didn't remember telling him her name. Perhaps she had. Perhaps the day had told it for her, and the rain had carried it here. Later, after the wind taught the windows how to rattle and the radiator discovered a new way to knock in the pipes, she woke to a silence so complete it made a sound. The apartment held its breath. She got up and padded to the doorway. The couch was a dark shape in the gloaming. For a heartbeat, she thought it empty. Then the shape moved. The smallest adjustment, and the outline of him, shoulders, the bridge of his nose, the longer sweep of his throat, resolved itself. Something in her chest made a small noise she pretended she could not hear. She went back to bed and lay looking at the place where the ceiling met the wall. She thought about the interview she had wanted and the job she did not get, about the version of her life in which she had kept walking, and what that woman had for dinner tonight, and whether she dreamed easier. She thought about the way his eyes had gathered the alley and everything in it, then returned to her. She thought about memory as a room with doors locked from both sides. In the grey hour before morning decides whether to try again, Nell drifted into a sleep made thin by the storm's hand. She dreamed, not of office chairs and glossy reception areas, but of a forest she had never walked through, and of something large moving through it with quiet certainty, and of the sensation of being watched, not with threat, but with the kind of attention that says, "I will know you in the dark." The morning had left Nell raw, her nerves stretched thin between the lost interview and the stranger who now stood damp and immense in her living room. The apartment seemed to shrink around him, every corner suddenly too close, every surface suddenly aware of its imperfections. She kicked off her wet shoes by the door, tried to quiet the pounding of her heart, and reminded herself that she had chosen this, had opened her door, had offered him sanctuary. And yet, now, faced with the reality of his presence, she wondered if kindness had been nothing more than reckless impulse disguised as virtue. The man had not moved farther than 2 steps inside. His eyes swept the room with unsettling focus, lingering on the peeling paint at the window frame, the second-hand table with one leg perpetually uneven, the bookshelf crowded with paperbacks bent from use. He seemed to weigh each object not with judgment, but with some deeper recognition, as though cataloguing details that mattered to him alone. Still, his silence pressed on her like a question she couldn't answer. "You should shower," she blurted, her voice higher than she liked. She thrust the bundle of clothes at him, the sweater and jeans left behind by someone who no longer belonged in her life. "I mean, before I look at that wound again, you'll get an infection if you don't." For a heartbeat, he did not take them. Then his fingers brushed hers as he accepted the stack, and the brief contact sent a current of awareness up her arm. He inclined his head slightly, almost formal, as if acknowledging a debt. "Thank you." The bathroom door closed, and the sound of water running through old pipes filled the silence. Nell stood motionless, listening, until she realized how absurd she must look, watching a door, waiting for proof that she hadn't made a mistake. She shook herself, set the kettle on the stove, and tried Morrison Associates once more. But the rejection had already hardened. Her chance was gone. The dial tone mocked her until she hung up. When the bathroom door opened again, she was not prepared. He emerged, transformed, shorn of grime and shadow. His features startled her. An austere beauty, the kind of symmetry one might see in marble busts displayed behind glass. Clean-shaven, his jaw caught the light in a way that made him look both younger and more dangerous. The sweater clung softly to his shoulders, the jeans shaping themselves around his long legs as if they had been tailored. He looked less like a man saved from the rain, and more like someone who had stepped, incongruous and impossible, out of another world entirely. She swallowed, turned toward the bandages as though the act of fussing with gauze could steady her. "Sit," she commanded, though her voice trembled. He obeyed, lowering himself onto the couch with a grace that suggested discipline, not fatigue. She peeled back the damp fabric near his ribs, revealing the wound again, and her chest tightened. The cut was deeper than she had hoped, cleaner than any accident. It looked deliberate. "This will sting," she murmured, soaking cotton in peroxide. His expression did not change when the liquid fizzed angrily against the open flesh. He simply watched her, his gaze steady, and something about that composure unsettled her more than any grimace could have. It was as though pain belonged to another species, one he only resembled but did not share. She pressed fresh gauze to his skin, and her fingers brushed the heat of him. The faint tremor in her hands betrayed her. "You should really see a doctor," she whispered. "This will do." His words were final, not defiant but absolute, as if he had lived long enough to know when he could afford care and when he could not. The storm outside pressed its fists against the windows, thunder muttering like an old god. The apartment dimmed with each flicker of light. She secured the last strip of tape, leaned back, and exhaled. "Stay," she said softly, "at least until it passes." His amber eyes caught hers, unreadable, but then he inclined his head. "Just until the storm passes." Later, as the city groaned beneath the weight of wind, Nell lay awake in her bed, listening. Every creak of the old building reminded her that he was just beyond the wall. She imagined his long body on the couch, imagined the strength in those still hands, imagined the eyes that had met hers and seen through her small defenses. Sleep teased her, then fled. When she did drift at last, her dreams brought her back into the living room. The couch no longer held a man, but a wolf, massive and dark, its head resting where his had been. It breathed slowly, a rhythm that should have frightened her, but didn't. Even in the dream, she wondered why her heart recognized him without fear, why something primal in her whispered that he belonged there, that she belonged beside him. The next morning, the storm had not relented. She emerged to find him already awake, standing at the stove with a mug in his hand. He turned and offered it to her, steam curling upward like a secret. "Coffee." She accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing his again. The warmth seeped into her bones, but it was his quiet presence that steadied her. He had no name, no past, and yet he filled the room as if he had always lived there. As she watched him move through her small kitchen, she could not help the thought that rose in her. Whoever he was, whatever he had been, he was no ordinary man, and already, impossibly, dangerously, she was not the same woman she had been before the rain led her down that alley. The storm did not leave quietly. It lingered at the edges of the morning like a guest unwilling to take its leave, battering the windows with gusts that whistled through the cracks in the old frames. Nell drew her robe tighter around herself and padded barefoot into the living room. The small space smelled faintly of coffee and the sharper tang of antiseptic, the scent of both comfort and reminder. He sat on the couch, awake, his posture straight, despite the exhaustion she knew must coil inside him. When he turned his head, the light caught his eyes, and she felt that same jolt she had felt in the alley, that unsettling amber, at once wild and impossibly controlled. "Good morning," he said, and the sound of his voice seemed to steady the room, as though everything in it answered to that tone. He held a second mug toward her. Steam curled between them. "You didn't have to," she began, but the words withered as her fingers closed around the warm ceramic. Their hands brushed. Her breath faltered. "Thank you." She tried to drink, but her mouth was too dry, her heart too restless. She moved toward the small bookshelf against the wall, if only to give her hands something else to do. He followed her with his gaze, not with suspicion, but with a kind of curiosity that weighed more than it should have. Her books were hardly impressive, paperbacks bent from years of second-hand lives, old textbooks she hadn't had the heart to part with, a few novels that had stayed with her through every move. His fingers skimmed along the spines, pausing on the worn lettering of the brothers Karamazov. He touched it as though the book had spoken his name. "You've read this?" he asked, his brow furrowed as if the answer already teased at the edges of his lost memory. "I've tried," Nell admitted with a small smile. "Heavy going, but worth it, I think." His hand lingered on the spine. "I think I remember a character, Dmitri." His lips shaped the name slowly, tasting it. Yes. He was conflicted, but redeemable. The word caught something inside her. Redeemable. She turned toward him, coffee forgotten in her hand, and studied his face. The face of a man who claimed he could not remember his own name, who had bled in an alley, yet looked at her now with the composure of someone used to command. Redeemable, as though he feared he was something else entirely. "Then that's what I'll call you," she said softly. "Dmitri, until you remember." His gaze flicked to hers, and for the briefest second she thought she saw relief, a tether thrown across the storm of his amnesia. "Dmitri," he repeated, and when he said it, it sounded like something ancient returning home. The morning stretched into something that felt dangerously close to ordinary. She cooked eggs and bacon while he moved around her small kitchen with the ease of someone who had never been there before, but somehow knew where everything belonged. He asked questions about the building, about her neighbors, about her work. His interest was sharp, but never unkind, as if each answer mattered more than she realized. When she set the plate before him, he smiled, not a smile of practiced charm, but something unguarded, brief and devastating. She found herself smiling back before she could think better of it. The storm outside snarled against the walls, but inside the world had narrowed to the scrape of cutlery against porcelain, the warmth of coffee cooling between them, and the sense that this stranger, this Dmitri, was stitching himself into the fabric of her life with threads she could not see until they pulled taut. By afternoon, the storm worsened. Rain fell in torrents so heavy she could hardly see the building across the street. The walls trembled with each clap of thunder. She found herself pacing, restless energy sparking under her skin. The thought of him, out there alone, had haunted her the night before. Now he was here, close enough that she could hear the quiet shift of his breathing as he leaned against the window frame. "You're worried," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. She paused mid-step. "About the storm." His lips twitched faintly. "Not just the storm." She wanted to deny it, but her throat betrayed her with silence. She turned away, busying herself with clearing dishes that no longer needed clearing. Her fingers trembled against the porcelain. He crossed the room, soundless despite his size, and when he was close enough that the warmth of him brushed against her back, she felt her breath stutter. "You took me in," he said quietly, "when you had no reason to, when it cost you more than you could afford. That kind of worry is not weakness." The words struck her in a place too tender to name. She set the plate down before she dropped it and turned slowly, her eyes lifting to his. His face was inches from hers, his gaze steady and unreadable, and yet she felt the weight of it as though he had touched her. The lights flickered with the storm's rage, and in that moment, as shadows danced across his features, she thought again of the wolf from her dream. The image unsettled her, but not with fear, with recognition. "Stay," she whispered, and though the word was simple, she knew it meant more than shelter from the storm. "I will," he said, and his voice carried something that sounded like a vow. That night, sleep was a fragile thing. Nell tossed beneath her thin blanket, every creak of the building reminding her of the man just beyond her door. Her body thrummed with awareness. At last, unable to resist, she slipped quietly into the living room. Moonlight painted the space in silver. Dmitri sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the window as though guarding against something unseen. He turned when he heard her, and his eyes caught the light like fire caught in amber. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head, her hair spilling loose around her shoulders. She wore only her nightgown, and the air of the room felt colder against her skin, though she suspected it had little to do with the weather. "I thought maybe tea," she murmured, her voice unsteady. He rose, his movements deliberate, and stepped closer. The air between them tightened. She backed instinctively until her hips pressed against the kitchen counter. His presence filled the room, filled her, until there was nothing left to hear but the low hum of her own pulse. "Nell," he whispered, her name rough in his throat, and the sound of it undid her. Her hands rose to push him away, but instead they curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. His breath ghosted against her skin. "You've been so kind to me," he said, his voice a confession. "Let me give something back." The kiss came like the storm outside, wild, reckless, inevitable. His mouth crashed against hers, and she yielded, her heart pounding with the terrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The night stretched into a blur of heat and shadow, of whispers and gasps, of two bodies tangled as though they had been waiting all their lives to find each other. When dawn broke at last, the storm outside had quieted, but inside another storm had taken root, one that would not pass so easily. Nell lay in the quiet after, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. She should have felt fear or regret, or at the very least doubt. But all she felt was the deep, unshakable knowledge that something had shifted, that whatever name he wore, whatever past lay hidden from them both, she had crossed a line with him that could not be undone. And when his hand brushed tenderly across her hair, when his lips pressed against her forehead with a gentleness that contradicted the ferocity of the night, she realized with a start that she no longer wanted it undone. The rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than thunder. For 2 days, Nell moved through the rhythms of her small life as though wearing someone else's skin. Jobs she didn't care about, errands she barely remembered, evenings spent staring at the couch where Dmitri had slept, her chest aching with the echo of his absence. The city outside carried on, the streets filling with chatter and honking horns, but to Nell it all seemed muffled, a world happening at a distance she could no longer cross. She told herself she had known him for less than 48 hours, that she had no right to feel the hollow ache clawing at her ribs. People didn't fall that fast, didn't bind themselves to strangers with nothing but stolen glances and storm-tossed nights. Yet the truth was undeniable. He had unsettled her world the way lightning splits a tree, suddenly, irrevocably, leaving her unable to imagine how the branches had ever stood without that scar. When the next storm rolled across the city, Nell found herself pacing her apartment. Rain lashed against the windows, and her chest tightened with each gust of wind, imagining him out there, soaked and shivering, a shadow pressed against some forgotten wall. She tried to distract herself, folding laundry, scrubbing the sink, but every chore fell apart under the weight of her thoughts. By nightfall, she couldn't bear it any more. She grabbed her coat and an umbrella and stepped out into the tempest. The streets had become rivers, torrents of water sweeping leaves and trash into choked gutters. The wind tore at her umbrella until it bent like a wounded bird. She clung to building walls, forcing herself forward, searching alleyways, every shadow threatening to be him and then dissolving into nothing. Her hair plastered to her cheeks, her teeth chattered, but her determination only grew sharper with the storm's fury. At last, in the narrow alcove between two buildings, she saw him. Dmitri. His dark figure hunched, rain sluicing down his borrowed sweater, his face pale in the dim streetlight. Her heart lurched painfully. "Dmitri!" she cried, fighting the roar of the storm. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something softer, something that looked like hope. "You're still here," she said breathlessly, stepping closer, her umbrella nearly torn from her grip. A small, weary smile touched his mouth. "I thought, just in case." The words pierced her. Just in case she came looking. Just in case she hadn't forgotten him. Warmth surged through her chest despite the cold rain. "Come back with me," she pleaded, reaching for his arm. "Please, you can't stay out here in this." For a moment he resisted. She could see the battle in his amber eyes, the instinct to keep himself apart, to shield her from whatever darkness still clung to him. But then another gust of wind nearly toppled her, and his hand shot out, steadying her with a grip that was both gentle and unyielding. "The storm's getting worse," she whispered. "I won't sleep knowing you're out here." He searched her face, his expression taut with unspoken fears, and then at last he nodded. Relief surged through her so strong she nearly sagged against him. "Just until the storm passes," he agreed, and the phrase was both familiar and different this time, carrying the weight of something they both knew could no longer be temporary. Back in her apartment, the air was thick with the scent of rain and electricity clinging to their clothes. They stood in the small entryway, droplets dripping from their hair, silence pressing between them. Nell fetched towels, thrusting one at him, acutely aware of how the wet fabric of his sweater clung to the planes of his chest. Her pulse thundered louder than the storm outside. "You can change," she said, her voice shaking as she handed him dry clothes. I'll go get some sleep." But neither of them moved. They lingered in the living room, the air between them vibrating with all the things left unsaid. She tried to speak, failed, tried again. "Well, good night." She retreated to her bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Every sound beyond the thin wall, the shift of the couch cushions, the quiet creak of his footsteps, made her body tense with restless longing. After what felt like hours, she gave up. Barefoot, she crept to the door and pressed her ear to it. Silence. Carefully, she eased it open. Moonlight spilled across the room, illuminating him sitting on the couch, elbows braced on his knees, staring out at the storm-lit night. His eyes glowed faintly in the silver light, catching her breath. "Can't sleep either," she whispered. He turned, his gaze fixing on her like gravity. "No," he murmured. She stepped into the room, suddenly too aware of the thinness of her nightgown, the bareness of her legs against the cool air. She fumbled for words. "I thought maybe I'd make some tea. Chamomile. It helps sometimes." Something dark flickered in his eyes. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, until he stood only a breath away. She backed instinctively until the counter pressed against her spine. He stopped, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. his breath stirring the air against her throat. "Nell," he whispered, her name tasting different in his mouth this time. Rough, intimate, a plea wrapped in hunger. Her lips parted, a protest trembling there, but when his head dipped, when the bridge of his nose brushed her skin, the words melted. Her hands rose to push him away, but instead they curled into his shirt, clutching, pulling him closer. "I don't want tea," he murmured against her throat, his lips grazing her skin like a spark teasing kindling. Her body betrayed her, arching into him, every nerve alight. "Dimitri," she breathed, his name more confession than warning. And then his mouth claimed hers, the kiss crashing over her like the storm outside, wild, desperate, unstoppable. She clung to him, her heart hammering with the terrifying certainty that nothing could ever be the same again. The storm outside raged on, but inside they found a fiercer tempest, one that devoured every hesitation and left only need. Hours blurred into heat and shadow, into whispered names, and the reckless joining of two souls who had found in each other both danger and salvation. When dawn came, pale light filtering through rain-streaked glass, Nell lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. She should have been afraid of how quickly, how completely he had become necessary to her. She should have feared the secrets that still lingered in his silence, the mysteries in his amber eyes, but she couldn't. Because when his hand brushed tenderly over her hair, when he pressed a kiss to her forehead with aching gentleness, she understood something she hadn't dared admit until now. She was already his, in ways that could not be undone. Morning slid in under the curtains like a shy guest, the storm's tantrum reduced to the soft ticking of water from the gutters. He was at the window again, the sweater she'd given him hanging easy on his frame, his gaze angled toward the street as if listening to something she could not hear. "Hungry?" she asked, pretending she hadn't spent half the night memorizing the weight of his arm around her, the slow discipline of his breath when sleep finally overtook him. He turned with a small nod. "Always." She cracked eggs into a pan. The hush of butter, the small domesticity, calmed her. It felt almost laughable that the world could be as simple as heat and salt when a man with no past was standing in her kitchen wearing someone else's clothes and a wound that didn't belong to any ordinary story. She plated breakfast and slid the dish toward him. He watched her for a beat longer than politeness required. "You didn't sleep much." "I slept enough," she lied. He took a bite, chewed, then lifted his head sharply, the way a deer does when the forest changes. The hairs along her arms prickled. "What?" she asked, instinctively lowering her voice. He didn't answer. He set the fork down, crossed the room in 3 soundless strides, and pressed his palm to the wall near the floor vent. His body stilled, attention tunneled. When he spoke, it was a rough whisper, as if he were careful not to disturb whatever he was listening to. "Do you smell it?" "Smell what?" She came to stand beside him. All she caught was the ordinary odor of old paint and coffee and damp. "Burnt metal," he said. "Rotten air." His eyes flicked to the hallway. "Stay here." "Hold on. What are you—" He was out the door before she finished, moving with a focused economy that turned the building's narrow corridor into a corridor of purpose. She grabbed her keys and ran after him, the world lurching into the pace of his urgency. Down the stairs, past the framed evacuation map that no one had looked at in years, to the stubborn door marked "Boiler Room, Authorized Personnel Only." "It's locked," she said, breathless. He braced a shoulder, tested the frame. The lock groaned, then split with a splintering crack. Not anymore. Heat breathed out, stale and wrong. The room smelled like a half-forgotten machine, sick and humming. He strode toward the old furnace, the pipes overhead coughing a faint rhythm. He knelt, tilted his head, sniffed the seam where pipe met brick, then swore under his breath, not in English. "Open the back door," he said. "Now, we need air through here." She ran, fumbling with the rusted exit bar, shoving it wide to the small fenced alley where rain still dripped from the roof's edge. Wind rolled in, dragging fresher air with it. He moved with swift competence, switches thrown, a valve shut, a window wrenched up. He didn't look like a drifter in stolen clothes. He looked like someone who had learned somewhere to make broken things obey. Sirens arrived after the neighbors began to spill into the hallway in confused, knotted clusters. Mrs. Chen in her house slippers, a courier with his bike helmet still clipped under his chin, Mr. Hoffman blinking owlishly. Firefighters filled the space with gear and calm orders. The chief squinted at the readings on a handheld meter and swore softly. "Lucky catch," he said, glancing at the broken door, then at the man at Nell's shoulder. "Could have been ugly." Lucky. The word felt too small for the way her knees went weak. Her landlord, Kay, appeared, indignant and sweating. "Who broke my door?" he demanded, as if the sin were not the poison but the wood. "You can't just—" "It was leaking," the chief cut in. "Carbon monoxide. Probably for weeks." Kay blanched, then tried a smile that slid off his face like bad wallpaper. "Well, you know how these old buildings—" "Fix it," Nell said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Properly, for everyone." Key's gaze darted toward the man beside her, then back to the firefighters, doing math that had nothing to do with pipes. Of course, he said quickly. 3 months reduced rent for all. I'll send a note." Relief rippled through the hallway like a soft animal, tongues of chatter unspooling into laughter that sounded nervous and new. Someone clapped the stranger on the shoulder. He bore it with the same restrained stillness he carried into everything. Back upstairs, the adrenaline drained, leaving Nell shaky and absurdly close to tears. "Thank you," she said, the 2 words too thin for the way she felt them. "How did you—" He shook his head as if he didn't understand the answer himself. "The air changed. You heard a leak." "Smelled it," he corrected, and his mouth curved, almost self-mocking, like he knew how impossible that sounded and said it anyway. When she changed his bandage that afternoon, her breath snagged. The angry, stitched-together gash she'd cleaned the night before had narrowed to a pale welt, edges neat, as if it were days old instead of hours. "It's healing," she said, the words coming out on a note that sounded like accusation. "Too fast." "Good," he said mildly, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something like apprehension. He looked down at himself with the curiosity of a man surveying a body he'd been issued without instructions. By evening, the building had returned to itself. Keir dropped off an apology letter printed on cheap paper and a chain of assurances no one quite believed. The neighbors retreated behind doors. Quiet grew like ivy along the baseboards. Nell stood in the kitchen scrubbing a plate that had been cleaned 10 minutes ago, the motion a way to keep stillness from swallowing her. "I should go," he said from the couch, the words landing carefully, as if they had been rehearsed. He'd showered again, his hair dried in soft, unruly waves. In borrowed jeans and a fresh shirt, he looked more like someone who had chosen simplicity than someone it had fallen upon. Her chest tightened in a muscle she didn't know could ache. "You could stay another night, just to be sure, in case the fix isn't—" He smiled slightly. "You're very responsible. Don't make fun of me." "I wouldn't dare." The smile faded. "But I should go." She busied her hands packing leftovers into a brown paper bag, added the last of the bread, a tangerine. She folded the top too neatly and held it out. When he took it, his fingers brushed hers. The electricity of it seemed almost embarrassing in the quiet room. "Thank you," he said softly, "for the everything." For the everything. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh and cry at once. "It's nothing," she lied, because telling the truth would loosen something she wasn't sure she could hold. He stepped toward the door, then paused, turned back as if the room had tugged him. "Nell," he said. She looked up. "If anyone ever hurts you," he said, and there was a thread of steel braided through the gentleness, "tell me." "Who would—" She stopped. She understood. "Okay." He left, and she watched the empty doorframe for a long time after he was gone, the apartment settling around her like an animal circling its small bed. 2 days were not enough time to forget him. They were barely enough time to learn the shapes absence can take, the phantom clink of a mug, a second pillow not used, how a laugh dies unanswered. She refused to check the alley. She refused to be that story. She failed on the 3rd night, caught in a storm that made the sky sound like an argument. She found him huddled in the alcove where the city hid its skeletons and said his name into the weather. He looked up, and the look he gave her, hope startled into tenderness, spooled something inside her too tight to name. "Come home," she said, and he did. They tried to pretend that it was about the rain. It wasn't. The truth arrived in pulses, in a word caught on an inhale, in a touch that didn't end where it ought to, in the way he tasted her name like he was learning it by heart. The night came greedy, and they let it. When morning softened back through the blinds, she knew with a clarity that frightened her that she had run out of places inside herself to store the pieces of him. He had become necessary, the way breathing is. It should have felt like the beginning of a beautiful story. It did, for a few hours. Then the world shouldered in and knocked something out of her hands. They were leaving the neighborhood cafe, arguing mildly about whether she could survive on vending machine dinners while waiting for paychecks that were late by nature, when a man in an expensive coat stepped into their path. He was middle-aged, confident in the way money trains a body. His eyes fixed on the stranger with a hatred so precise it was almost beautiful. "You," the man said, and the word was a blade. Nell's companion stilled. The air around him changed, as if a predator had opened its eyes. "I knew I'd find you," the man said, voice gone hoarse with triumph and fury. "Took 60 days, but there you are." "Sir," Nell started, hand rising in an instinct to diffuse things that didn't want to be diffused. "You must have—" "You don't get to hide behind a girl," the man snapped at her without looking. To the stranger, "Storm." The name fell like a switch thrown. People still moved around them, but it felt like the city had stepped a half-inch away, creating a ring. The stranger said nothing. His face was unreadable, the kind of stillness that looks like contempt even when it isn't. Blake Storm, the man insisted, savouring each syllable. The golden boy. The butcher. Do you know what it's like to tell 100 people the party's over because you decided a company you gutted would sell for parts better than it breathed whole? He took a step closer. His cologne smelled like cedar and anger. You ruined my life. I recognize your face even under... His gaze flicked to the borrowed jeans. All this. Nell looked from one to the other, the street tilting. You're mistaken, she said, her own voice sounding far away. He doesn't remember who he is. The man laughed without humour. That's rich. He thrust a card toward her. A newspaper masthead, an email, a hook. When you're done pretending, Google him. Then ask yourself what he's doing in your neighbourhood with your heart in his pocket. He walked away before she could decide whether to throw the card back at his chest. She pretended her hands weren't shaking all the way home. He said nothing. Silence climbed the stairs with them. She spread magazines and old newspapers across her kitchen table like tarot. She typed the name into search bars. Faces and headlines leapt to life. Storm Industries, youngest this, richest that, suits that cost a car. A smile that looked like it had been taught in a lab. She held the glossy photo at arm's length and felt like she was drowning in a room with no water. He was at the stove when she returned to the living room, stirring something fragrant. He looked domestic in a way that hurt to look at. She wanted to throw the image against a wall just to hear it shatter. "Is this you?" she asked, and her own voice frightened her, how small and sharp it sounded. He took the magazine. He stared at the face on the page. For a long second, his expression went somewhere she couldn't follow. Then, quietly, "I don't know." He looked genuinely pained. "I don't remember this man." Tears rose too quickly. She shoved them back with anger because anger stood up when sorrow went to ground. "He has your bones," she said. "Your mouth. If it isn't you, it's a twin." He set the paper down with infuriating care. "I can't prove otherwise." "That's the problem," she said, and the bag of fear split open inside her. All the small certainties spilled into the room. "What do I do with that? With you? Do I pretend you're not?" She gestured helplessly at the past spread across her table. "This, and what does it say about me, that I took you in, and—" The next words were too sharp to voice. He flinched as if she'd thrown them anyway. "Nell," he said, and there was a begging in it that undid her. "I am only what I've been with you." "But the world will come knocking," she whispered. "It already has." Something in him tightened, a cord pulled to breaking. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked, very quietly. The calm in it skinned her. She could have said no. She could have said yes. She could have said, "Come to bed, and we'll pretend the morning never arrives." Instead, the fear dragged up something unkind in her, something desperate and clumsy. "I think you should," she said. He made the sound of a man swallowing pain. It wasn't a groan. It wasn't a word. And then his chest hitched. His breath came wrong, too fast, like the air had turned to needles. He staggered, one hand braced against the back of the couch. "Are you okay?" she asked, horror blasting a path through her anger. He shook his head once, jaw clenched. A low sound built in him, a rolling thing that vibrated in the floorboards. He dropped to his knees. "Dimitri," she breathed, falling beside him. "Hey, hey, look at me." He did, and for a heartbeat his eyes weren't human. Not just the colour, though the amber went molten, but the way they held her, as if a different intelligence looked out at her through them, older and inarguable. His spine bowed. The tendons stood out in his neck. Bones made small, terrible sounds beneath his skin. The world broke open at the seams. Where a man had been, a shape burst outward, dark and terrible and magnificent. A body made of strength and fur and heat. The wolf's chest heaved. Glass shattered. The sash screamed as it was shouldered aside. He leaped through the window into the rain, a streak of midnight with eyes like coins of fire. Her scream sounded useless even to herself. She didn't remember running to the window. She only remembered the rain in her face and the way the alley seemed to close around the darkness fleeing down it. "Come back," she whispered, to a night that did not return what it took. She didn't sleep. She called no one. She sat on the floor among the glittering shards and listened to the city breathe. They came for her 2 nights later, in a van that smelled like oil and damp rope. The rag pressed over her mouth tasted like the inside of a hospital. She woke tied to a chair in an old warehouse that had once believed in work and now only believed in echo. Men circled her, their movements carrying a wrongness she recognized before she could name it. Not quite human, not quite beast, something between. One of them grinned in a way that showed too many teeth. "Bait," he said cheerfully. "Such a pretty little lure." She told herself she would be brave. She told herself she would not cry. She failed both promises the moment she heard the growl. It rolled through the dark like thunder with a mouth. It lifted the hairs along her arms and shook the windows in their rotten frames. He stepped from the shadow like something the night had built and then set free. Bigger than she remembered, darker, a bruise shaped like a god. He padded forward, head low, eyes on the knife at her throat. "Ah," the man with the smile said. "There he is, our alpha." What followed was fast and awful and inevitable. Blood, heat, teeth, a ballet the body understands, even when the mind refuses it. He fought with the precision of someone who had trained for it in a world with different rules. When it was done, silence fell like ash. He swayed on his feet, then he dropped, a sack of breath and blood in the shape of a man again, pale and human and broken on the concrete. She crawled to him, hands useless and frantic. "Stay," she begged, as if he were a dog and not a savior. "Stay with me." Headlights carved the far wall. 3 silhouettes entered with the casual confidence of people who owned consequences. They smelled like money and rain and something that made the back of her tongue taste metallic. The oldest, a man with knife-grey hair, knelt and slapped the stranger's face lightly, almost affectionate. "Blake," he said, "open your eyes." The woman produced a syringe and drove it home. The stranger gasped, consciousness slamming back into him like the tide. When he sat up, there was no Dmitri in him. There was the man from the magazine, stripped of all the blur. His gaze went diamond. His first words were a snarl about a merger, and the man with the briefcase almost wept with relief at being scolded. Nell stood there, hollowed. This was what she had feared, that when the world found him, he would evaporate and leave her holding the shape of his absence. "What about the girl?" the woman said, as if asking what to do about a coffee cup left on a conference table. He looked at Nell, then, For a moment, half a breath, something human flickered, a recognition the size of a pulse. Then it was gone, hidden so fast she could have believed she imagined it. "See her home," he said. "Have her sign." "Sign what?" Nell asked, though she knew. Paper could erase entire lives. They returned her to a couch that smelled like him and asked her to initial her own forgetting. She did not. She ripped the pages and shut the door softly in their faces. For 2 weeks, the apartment became a museum of a person who had been allowed to exist and then politely removed. She went to work. She ate because people brought things and hovered until she took a bite. She learned the exact shape of the window he'd broken and how light changed around that absence at different hours of the day. On the 14th night, it rained again. She didn't mean to go to the alley. Her feet took her there like memory does, without permission. The rain blurred everything into the same shade of truth. When the umbrella tilted over her head, she knew where she was before she looked. He stood beside her in a suit the color of quiet storms, his hair cut by someone who charged per strand, his shoes insulting the puddles. The eyes were the only part of him that hadn't been curated. "You're still here," he said softly, as if surprised to find himself speaking aloud. "Just in case," she said, and the words tried to break her. He held her face with his gaze, not his hands. The apology that followed wasn't handsome. It stumbled and was honest and left mud on his immaculate shoes. He talked about enemies like shadows and memory, like a switch you find in the dark and flip without knowing what it does to the rest of the house. He talked about a curse that sounded ridiculous until you remembered the night a wolf climbed out of the man you loved. He talked about how he had been that other man before, the one in the magazines, and how that man had earned every bad story told about him, and how he was afraid he would wear that skin forever if she wouldn't hold open a different door. "I'm not good," he said at last, voice ragged. "But with you, I wasn't bad." He gave a huff of a laugh, broken and sharp. "That's not poetry, I know." "No," she said, her own laugh dissolving into the rain on her lips. "It's better. Can you—" He stopped, started again, looked suddenly young under all the armor money buys. "Would you come anywhere near me, knowing what you know?" She thought of the alley and the pharmacy and the boiler room and the window and the warehouse. She thought of coffee and eggs and hands learning each other in the dark. She thought of what had been asked of her and what she still had to give. Then she stepped into the circle of the umbrella and the space his body made in the world. "Just in case," she said again, but this time the words meant something else. He made a sound then that was not quite relief and not quite disbelief. He leaned down. The kiss was not the storm. It was the thing after. The careful rebuilding, the promise made in daylight about what to do when the next weather comes. His hands were gentle on her jaw, as if reminding himself that even wolves can be tender. The rain kept time above them. Somewhere far off, the city cleared its throat and started a new rumor. She pulled back and looked at him fully, the parts of him that didn't match making a sense she could live inside. "You'll mess up," she said, because she was done pretending that love solved problems instead of complicating them. "I will," he agreed. "You'll tell me the truth when it's ugly." "I will try," he said, grimacing at his own honesty. "And when I fail, you can make me. You'll stop breaking my windows." He glanced up at the apartment, then back at her with a brightness that could almost be called humor. "No promises," he said, but I'll pay for the glass." She smiled then, a real one that reached places that had been dark for weeks. "Okay." "Okay," he echoed, as if these two letters were a spell old as language. They walked out of the alley together, not into a clean future, but into something imperfect and alive. Behind them, rain made small music in puddles. Ahead of them, the city unrolled, pocked with danger and delight. He offered her the umbrella without comment. She took the handle and tilted it over both their heads. Their shoulders touched, a small electricity alive in the simplest points of contact. "Tell me your real name," she said, because though she already knew it, she needed to hear what he would give her. He glanced sideways, amber eyes catching a passing light, and holding it. "I have had more than one," he said, "but the one that mattered most was the one you gave me." "Dimitri," she said, and the name tasted like home. "Then let's begin there." They did.